Hey there. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to BoldTV. We are happy to have Clay back with us. Good morning, Clay.
Morning. Have a good holiday?
You. I did. I had a great Easter. How was yours? How was your spring break?
It was very nice. And then I was in North Carolina. Decent weather. Come back up here. It's disgusting.
Well, so, bring that sunshine.
Too late. Too late. I've already supposed to snow it. This is getting tiresome. Let me explain something to you. I'm sick and tired of winter. I think I get seasonal affective disorder. I really do.
Well, you know what?
I really think
you're
going
to have a great time on the show.
Oh, good.
Okay,
let's
lift
fix
your
that.
Spirits.
Fix
yes.
that.
We got
how
a great
are you going to lift my spirits?
Because we've got Shocker Kazal coming with us. So he was born a Palestinian refugee, and he's an author who was named Man of the Year for Esquire's Middle East edition in 2015. So I think you'll like him, Clay.
Okay, that sounds uplifting.
Let's see by the end of the show if Clay's in a better mood.
Let's talk about what's going on in the news. That always makes me smile.
Yeah, well, I was on MSNBC talking about, I think, a double standard that I see
There's
as it relates to Shocker Kazal will be late.
Let me guess. A double standard as relates to media coverage?
Maybe, perhaps.
Okay, there's a surprise.
Let's roll the clip.
As Peter was saying, it's a family-run business, quoting a previous guest now in the White House. Do you take any issue with that? Does that disturb you at all?
Well, as a proud graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School, I think there's certainly precedent to see Kennedy family members who were involved, in the administration and also the Bush family and the Clinton family. So to have politics be a family affair, I think is actually quite normal, and to suggest somehow is this wild beast that doesn't know what he's doing, that is an emperor, that's against democracy, really is not based in history.
So, yeah, that HuffPost contributor had said that...
I'm mostly rolling my eyes on the Harvard Kennedy School shit.
I had to use the word Kennedy because it was Kennedy, and I'm obsessed with the Kennedys.
You didn't have to.
Kennedy, whatever. Okay. Anyway, the point is there's a double standard. Like, whenever Trump does something, he's becoming an emperor. That's literally what that HuffPost guy said.
What was he saying? Because you cut that part off. He was claiming that he's an emperor. He's trying to use his nepotism and family.
Yeah, because they had put Ivanka as the head of the infrastructure plan, and somehow that meant that Trump was becoming an emperor.
Yeah, but I imagine, and that was very cleverly edited to only have your side in it. So I imagine that many people are going to argue that there's a big difference between appointing your brother attorney general when he has mountains of experience as an attorney versus putting your daughter in charge of something simply because she did a good job designing dresses and shoes.
The other point that I actually made that I edited out too was that the New York Times said that Bobby Kennedy was grossly unqualified to be Attorney General at the time.
Okay.
So I do. At least they're consistent. I give them that.
Okay. There you go. That's enough. That's a win.
But the guy who was there on the show saying that he was an emperor, just like, no, come on.
Listen,
look at history.
that's hyperbole. He's not an emperor. That's nonsense. But it's also pretty much nonsense to assume that just because his daughter has made some shoes in the past and been on a TV show with him, that she's qualified to run the infrastructure plan for the entire country. I think you're talking apples and oranges here between the Kennedys and the Trumps. He's wrong by saying that makes him an emperor. But I think it's a false equivalence to imply that the family members have the same levels of experience. Well, and the other dynasties that you talk about, are people who were elected. One family member was elected, and then their cousin or their wife ran for office.
No, Bill Clinton put his wife, who was unelected, in charge of national health care policy, even though she had been the first lady of Arkansas, and that's about it. So,
but she was an attorney. She was an attorney. Ivanka Trump is not a businesswoman. She's not a transportation expert. But okay.
No, I see what she's doing more as being
I'll
a
give you the Hillary Clinton
communicator about the infrastructure plan. But okay, so the other headline this week that I wanted to segue in as it relates to this
smoothly
is the fact that President Trump has said that he's going to put the National Guard on the border. So he says we're going to be guarding our border with the military until the wall is complete. And somehow this is just, again, the emperor thing when there's precedence for this. President Obama did it.
Who said he was an
George
emperor
W.
because of
Bush.
this?
No,
you don't get to start creating lyrics to this song. If nobody called him an emperor because of the border thing, you don't get to start implying that they did. There are people who are upset about it, right? There's certainly people on the left who are upset about this move. I don't know if I'm going to be able to join with them for the same reason that I think you're about to explain, because it's been done before.
Exactly. Right. Well, and so that's all I'm asking for is that when people make these claims about how horrific President Trump is and how he's earth-shattering, you're actually kind of buying into his narrative, which is that he is a disruptor, but in many ways he's continuing things that were already done before.
But if there is something to be concerned about, I think it's the fact that he didn't tell anybody in his administration that that's what he was going to do. A lot of policy in this administration tends to come from speeches at rallies or tweets. The military was not warned about this, was not informed of it, and I think that probably is the thing that concerns me the most. And potentially the fact that he didn't necessarily know what type of military he was allowed to send. Yes, the National Guard can go, but the governors have to call them up. The fact that we're guarding the border, I think, is something that we can't get upset about. But I do think it's a continuation of policies being determined at a rally because they become the largest applause line, and that concerns me.
That's what I find interesting is because President Trump has seen his approval ratings going up, and he says that at least the word on the street is that it's going up because the people who are trying to constrain Trump are now getting out of the way.
Listen, I can run a poll. I can run a poll that makes gonorrhea popular. That doesn't mean that the poll is accurate or valid. And the truth is, his popularity, his approval rating. Yeah, it is depending on how you word it. His approval rating is at one of its lowest points right now. If you look at Real Clear Politics and their average of polls, you can look at Rasmussen and say, yes, that they did go up in that. But that's one poll. It tends to be an outlier, and a lot of people would say that it's biased. So I disagree with you again. Surprise, surprise.
Shocker.
Let's. You want to move on?
Yeah. Let's. We can put up one marker that I think that we can have a bipartisan agreement on.
Let's see.
Is a tweet from the president this week marking MLK's 50th anniversary, sadly, since his assassination. And the president said, "Today we honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the 50th anniversary of his assassination. Earlier this year, I spoke about Dr. King's legacy of justice and peace and his impact on uniting Americans. MLK 50.
I'm glad he put that up.
I am too. Let's leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that
All
for
right.
now.
And we'll move on to our first guest. He's a Bold partner, Peter Cove, a dear friend of mine, and he's the author of Poor No More. He's also the founder of America Works and Work First Foundation. And Peter has dedicated his life to empowering individuals living in poverty through providing them with real-life jobs and helping them find jobs that match their skills, and then also helping them move up the ladder. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So explain America Works and tell us why you started it.
Well, America Works is an employment agency, but it's for people who normally wouldn't get into the workforce. And so we ease them into companies and support them on the job. And because of that, they usually stay on the job, which is exactly what we want, and get them off of government dependence.
Why do you think your model works so well as opposed to other models?
Two things. First, we're paid for performance. We only get paid if the person gets a job and stays in a job.
For how long?
Depends on the contract, usually 6 months, sometimes a year. And that's the first thing. So we're not paid for a program. And America Works actually initiated that with government. They really didn't want to have that. They'd rather pay for a program, and I could explain that. It's political, but we got them to do it.
Well, and you talk about this in your book, Poor No More, about why, in your view, because you came in and you talk in the phrase you said you were at Woodstock, you bought into the narrative around civil rights and pairing civil rights with welfare programs, which I think is a very interesting pairing that you make the argument in your book that this sort of pairing has been a mismatch.
Oh, it absolutely has been a mismatch. And what we were able to do is to get the private sector to buy into this and to help people who normally would not have been helped by the private sector. So we were able to get the people transitioned into the jobs. And the other thing that made the difference was we supported them when they were on the job, because often there is something I call static in their lives. There's an abusive mate, or the housing is not so good, or transportation isn't there, or they don't understand the mores of the workplace.
So you talk a few times, you've said a few times, those people who normally wouldn't be able to get a job, who do you find those folks are?
Who
are those?
We have welfare recipients, veterans coming back, many of them homeless, people who are on disability. By the way, that's the largest growing welfare population in our country right now, is people on disability.
And what is the factor that they all tend to have in common, in your mind?
A lack of access to the jobs and a lack of understanding how to present themselves at the job.
Is there not an argument that at some point, once you have so many barriers in front of you, that it's getting past those initial barriers of poverty that make it very difficult, if not near impossible, for a lot of people to find work?
We look at the assets rather than the liabilities of the individual.
But do employers?
When we present the people to them, yes, they do. And particularly right now, with the unemployment rate what it is, they do. But yes, they will do that. The important thing is, will they show up? Will they be there at 9 o'clock on Monday morning and 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon? If they do that, the employers don't really care what they have.
So we have a clip of you on Fox Business talking about, I think, a very interesting concept about sort of the value of work for the individual who's working. Let's roll that clip.
I think what we should be doing, and I had this in my book last year, Poor No More, is that we should take the money that we're spending on welfare and on poverty programs and take that money and convert it into jobs in the private sector where possible and in the public sector if there aren't enough, so that you have people working, not staying home and getting a check. People want to work. In the early 1960s, Pope John Paul II said, if you take work away from a man, you're denying him part of his spirituality. I really believe that. After working over 50 years in poverty programs around the United States, I can tell you, yes, there are a few bums out there, but almost everyone wants to work. Right. Why don't we use the money to have them work?
Do you think that is an idea that people on the right buy into? Because most of the time when I watch, we'll call them right-wing outlets, there's strong arguments that people want to be lazy. People just want to sit around and take their check. And I find that to be bafflingly wrong. Do you feel that there are people who will not accept the reality that most people would like to work?
I've done this over 50 years, as just mentioned. I hardly ever see people who don't want to work. There are some out there, as I said, a few bums out there. But there's the major problem is government sets up conditions for dependence and not allowing people to move into the private sector or into jobs. It is less one of individual will and one of the government not allowing people or not making it easier for people to move in.
There are folks who, and that I think was part of the argument behind workfare in the 90s that Clinton wanted to, because there are programs, disability now, if you are disabled and have a difficulty getting to work or working in certain jobs, as soon as you get a job that you're capable of working in, you lose all disability. Well, the truth is
that's not true, Clay.
For a lot of people,
No, there's now a program, we run it, but it's run all over the country by government, which is called Ticket to Work. And that allows the individual who is now on SSI or SSDI to go into a job and to be weaned off of the payment. But if they lose the job for any reason, they can go back onto
right, but that's a program that's run. That's a program that flows through nonprofits like yourself. I mean, that's not a program of the government.
By the way, we're a for-profit company.
That runs through companies like yourself. Yes. So that runs through third party. That's not something that's as accessible to most people who are on. And you know, a lot of these programs people don't know about. People who are on disability don't know about.
I think that's right.
I don't know that you can necessarily blame someone and say they don't want to work if they're not aware of these programs.
Oh, I agree.
Well, on the issue of disability, so you mentioned in your book there's been a 59% growth of people on SSDI, the disabled, from 2012 or from 2002 to 2012. So over a 10-year period of 59% growth. What do you think's driving that? And do you think that this is a problem you said people want to work. Is this a problem of fraud, or is this people who? Why are we having a 59% growth?
Part of it is that, in the welfare programs, people could only stay 5 years. And then after the 5 years, often the people in government would encourage them to go on to disability so they could continue to receive money from the government. The other thing is an industry has built up of lawyers. There are billboards that say, you want to get onto disability? Call this number and we'll get you onto disability. So it was a growth industry for lawyers, and people ended up going into the disability programs.
Well, that's what I find interesting in terms of the mentality, because I got into a debate with one of my former classmates who works in government in Philadelphia, and we were debating sort of the nature of welfare and public assistance. To me, getting on public assistance is a sign of distress, but for him, it's a sign of success, as in we're helping people. And in your book, you talk about, you said that failure in the lives of the people became success for the welfare worker, in the sense of there was more money that was being flowing into these programs. Right. So how can we there's clearly a completely different processes, in mental process in terms of how we think about poverty. If I'm someone on the right and I think this is a sign of distress, but someone on the left says this is a sign of success because we're helping people who need it, how do we overcome that?
Because we have to have people understand it's a sign of people not understanding that work is available, that the private sector will absorb them, that they can be a productive member of society and not just take money from the government. And, I've had a real problem, and I've written a few op-eds on this, with the universal basic income, where people are supposed to be getting $10,000 a year just for doing nothing. For me, that's ridiculous. People want to work. Why pay them to not work? Let's pay them to work. Let's.
You think people can live on $10,000 a year?
No.
Okay, well then why would people want to go on to $10,000 a year and be lazy and not work? I guess I'm trying to understand how people can make the argument that folks are just sitting around being lazy when no one can live off of $10,000 a year.
Not at all, but I don't think people would live off $10,000. You can't really live off of welfare, but other income comes in. There is maybe somebody living in the house, somebody's giving you some money, you're working odd jobs. You're absolutely right.
The issue, I think there's a lot of false information out in the world about what people are trying to do. This is one of those subjects that it's easy to kind of break down, put it on a bumper sticker, to make it look like people are lazy. But I'm going to take issue with its success because we're helping people, and say that the appropriate reason for welfare is to be able to give people the leg up, to be able to get on to go have a job. And if there are measures in place that are making it more difficult for people to do that by losing the supplement that they're getting, then I agree. We need to fix that part of the issue. And what you're doing is essentially trying to do that.
You need to have work requirements in any government program that supports people, so that able-bodied people will go to work if there is a job. It's very, very important to have that. And I want to just say, after over 50 years working with poor people around this country, I have two things to say to people who are watching this. First, people do want to work. And again, there are a few bums out there, but people really do want to work. And second, watch out for government, because they put roadblocks in the way for people getting those jobs.
We have a comment here from Facebook. Leanne Chinloy says, our justice system is a huge barrier for very qualified people that incur minor infractions that have hefty punishments, fines, etc. Let's reform our education and justice system, and the rest will correct itself. What do you see for the people who are coming through America Works? Are they dealing with this issue? How do you mitigate that?
Well, frankly, the one way we deal with it is we take people coming out of the criminal justice system and place them in jobs. We get them employed. We get them working. And they really do want to work.
But if they don't have a program like that, having that sort of infraction or having that on their record pretty much is a no-go. Most folks will not hire someone who has a felony, regardless of what it is, because they're not going to look past it and look into trying to figure it out.
I think that's right.
And so programs like New York with the, what do they call it? Don't check the box, or
ban the box.
Ban the box. Where they ban the ability for the employer
Yes.
to ask if someone
Yes.
on the initial application.
Yes.
Do you think those are good? Do you think that's the type of thing that we should be looking at elsewhere too?
I think we should be looking at anything that encourages the private sector to hire people. And the thing that encourages them is to put people in front of them who are qualified, and never sell the disability. You don't want to say, well, oh, we've got somebody here who is disabled, so you should hire them. We've got somebody here who's on welfare. You should hire them. We believe that you sell the person assets, not their disabilities.
It can't hurt to have folks who are vouching for them with the employer as well.
Exactly.
Which not a lot of people have, so I appreciate that
Well,
you're doing that.
we have it in our lives.
Well, but we
they
do
don't,
have someone
but they
vouching,
don't.
but those folks don't.
That's
And
exactly
for
right.
those that you are
Well,
doing
that's why
that
we
for,
become the old
and
boys
you're
network
helping,
for them.
I appreciate that. I wish more people had access to it or knew more about it.
I do too.
But you can find
Tell the
out
government.
more about it by checking out bold.global. There'll be some information about America Works on the website. And Peter Cove, thank you very much for being
Thank you
with us.
for having me. Take care.
Thanks.
You don't, at the very least, can we, gosh, I'm so worried about getting in this conversation with you. Can we at least agree that there is some misinformation out there and that the rhetoric that says that there are just people who are trying to live off welfare and want to do nothing else isn't necessarily true?
Well, I agree with Peter. I think that most people do want to work. I think that so many people have been fed this narrative that they are a liability. I think what he was saying about liability versus asset is a mindset. And I think some people get so trapped in the negative liability mindset that for some of them, they've sort of lost the will. And so for some of them, it is hard to break out of that. And that's a function of, it's a combination of, yes, they need to be able to pull themselves up by their bootstrap, but it's sad that we let our culture get them to that point.
That's the whole purpose of trying to get people out. Well, we got to do about this another day when I'm not a little frustrated by the whole conversation. Let's talk about something that doesn't frustrate me at all. North Korea. So we got a lot of North Korea in the news right now for very interesting and somewhat positive and negative reasons. Gordon Chang's with us. He's a Daily Beast columnist and the author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. And we also have, here we go, I'm going to see if I can do it, Mene Ukwebarua.
Perfect.
Ukwebarua.
Truly nailed it.
Did I do it?
It's always a little bit easier than it looks.
Mene Ukwebarua. I know. I did practice a little bit. He's the Wall Street Journal's assistant editorial features editor for the opinion page, so that's not an easy job.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have a busy workload, but it's lots of fun too.
You've pushed back on the president a few times and supported some of the things that he's done as well.
Sure.
North Korea is interesting because, and I'll give my thought on it, and then because we obviously want to get yours. Carrie and I have a disagreement. We've had a disagreement in the past about the motivation behind Trump's whether Trump had a strategy with North Korea or not. I tend to think that he didn't have a strategy, but his volatility, his unpredictability has led us to a place where we haven't been led before. Carrie thinks he planned that all along. I'm telling you, he did not. But it has gotten us to a place where we are potentially going to be across the table from the North Korean president for the first time in how many years? Ever since they've been since his grandfather. So is this something that we should be nervous about, or is it something that you think will bear fruit?
Well, it's certainly something that needs to be approached with the utmost caution. I do think, to sort of give a bone to Kerry, that it's very likely that President Trump did intend the volatile approach that he took to his discussions with Kim Jong-un, sort of via the web, as a gambit that would apply pressure that could then be used in a potential conversation and negotiation.
We'll agree to disagree, but we are at the table. Mm-hmm. What makes you excited about that, and what concerns you about the fact that Donald Trump will be face-to-face with Kim Jong?
What concerns me is that this is about North Korea. Nothing ever goes right with North Korea. And of course, as you say, Trump is volatile. But, you know, if you put aside motivation for just a second, things are going very well. We know the sanctions are biting the North Korean regime. You know, the Chinese are saying, for instance, that office number 39, which is the Kim family slush fund, is running out of money. And also the South Koreans are saying that North Korea's foreign exchange reserves may be depleted by October. Now, I don't know if it's going to be October, but it does mean that Kim Jong-un, for the first time, and certainly maybe for the first time in the Kim history, they've got a reason to come to terms with the United States, because those sanctions can only get tougher if President Trump decides to turn the screw.
So Kim Jong-un went to China, which was his first visit after becoming leader. It's been 5 years now. So that was his first time beyond the borders. He goes to China. I mean, China's basically been North Korea's patron this entire time. And the fact that the sanctions are working is only a function, which, by the way, the Chinese are helping them evade, in my opinion, in certain ways.
Well, they certainly are.
But it is more effective, I think, this time versus in the past. But do you think that the Chinese will actually step up and do what they need? I'd love to hear that, your thoughts on both of you.
You can go first.
Well, I think it's likely that China has supported North Korea not because they have any sort of ongoing loyalty to their sort of brother regime, in as much as they want to use them for leverage to win concessions from the West. And so they will only support denuclearization of North Korea if it means that the United States is going to come to the table and actually entertain the possibility of granting them some things that they want. And that's exactly what President Trump is going to have to bear in mind in the negotiations.
What do they want?
Sure. Well, they have disputes with American allies, like Japan, for example, for some of these territories in the South China Sea. They want to make sure that they're exerting more leverage over Taiwan, and they don't like the fact that President Trump has been more open to directly collaborating and trading with Taiwan. So they're going to apply a lot of pressure to the United States to see if they'll give on some of these positions, whereas President Trump should make sure that any concessions we're making are simply lifting sanctions from North Korea, as opposed to, boosting China in its ability to sort of spread its regional dominance.
It's very interesting. So from what you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, that China, it's basically a three-way love triangle, as in there's never going to be just a direct, solo date, mano a mano, with the North Koreans and the Americans. Do you agree with that?
That's the way things are with the current set of incentives. But Trump can change those incentives, and there are a lot of things there's a range of possibilities here, go from the very best to the very worst. The one thing that Trump can do is, for instance, push the Chinese aside. There's a number of ways he can do that. For instance, taking the big Chinese banks, declaring them to be money launderers, which they are for the North Koreans, unplugging them from the global financial system, really pushing Beijing in a direction where they don't want to go. And then Trump can actually deal with the North Koreans one-on-one. Kim wants one-on-one. We know that because he sent the offer to Trump through the South Koreans to have direct talks. And that means direct talks without the Chinese. And that suits our interests as well, largely because the Chinese have been generally a malign influence in the six-party talks of last decade, and for doing other things like giving the North Koreans a boost up for their nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs in ways which violate all of China's obligations to the international community. So we want the Chinese off to the side as well, or should. And so Trump can do this. It's not a Kim question. It's not a Xi Jinping question, Xi Jinping, ruler of China. It's really a Trump question. What is Trump willing to do to exercise American power to achieve acceptable outcomes?
Well, we're seeing the president not necessarily cozy up to China himself right now with the tariffs that have been imposed. China retaliated, and there's discussion this morning that President Trump has asked his advisors to consider another $100 billion in tariffs to China. What kind of peripheral impact could this potential trade war have? I don't think people are necessarily connecting it to North Korea at the time, but we're talking so much about China being involved. What kind of impact might a trade war or a faux trade war or whatever we're going through right now have on China's willingness to help us?
Mm-hmm. Well, we saw not long after the president brokered the agreement to meet with Mr. Kim, China obviously approached the North Korean regime and made sure that they were going to be able to reinsert themselves. They invited Mr. Kim to come up to Beijing, and they had their secret two-day summit. And during that time, I would expect that Mr. Xi told Mr. Kim, basically, we are not going to cooperate with the American effort to create a bilateral deal to lift sanctions in return for denuclearization unless we have some seat at the table. I certainly agree that Mr. Trump should do his utmost to make sure that China is not the foremost player, that there is some kind of bilateral discussion going on. But I think North Korea understands that even if they do have sanctions lifted from the international community in return for denuclearization, they still are going to depend heavily on China for most of their trade, for most of their support. And so China is going to be involved in some way in the discussion.
Are we up to the task?
Well, we certainly have the power to do it. So even without the use of force. But the question is, are we willing to do it? We've seen the Chinese bust sanctions, as Carrie talked about. Yeah, they're better on sanctions enforcement than they were 2-3 years ago, but they're still not where they need to be. And by the way, those photographs of Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, there's a sanctions violation there because the Chinese are giving the North Koreans luxury items. It's there in the photographs. and you know, what the United States should be doing is we should be calling them out on that. And, for instance, money laundering, and, for instance, supplying technology in all probability for their ballistic missile program, and supplying components, equipment, and materials for their nuclear weapons program. We're not calling the Chinese out on this. So there's a lot that we can do to change the incentives on both Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un. We can solve this short of the use of force. We can actually get Kim to give up his weapons, but it's going to require an American president to do things that we haven't seen from the White House.
So some places we're tough and some places we're not.
I mean, isn't that part of negotiations? Carrots, sticks. I mean, and the fact that Xi Jinping has declared himself basically emperor for life, it's more accurate there than it is
today's
here.
word of the day. Emperor. President for life.
I mean, so he's there for the long haul. But, you know, Trump, in addition to the talk of, you know, the trade war or putting tariffs, there's also talk about what's happening with the World Trade Organization in terms of the fact that any Chinese or any American company that wants to go to China has to find a Chinese partner who basically will surrender the intellectual property to the Chinese firm. So it's really not fair, I think, for American companies to do trade with China. And no president has ever stood up except for this one now. I guess my question, Gordon, is like, with that backdrop, is the president trying to do too much with China vis-a-vis North Korea? If he's doing the tariffs, if he's doing the WTO, I mean, is he doing too much?
Well, unfortunately, we have to do too much because, for instance, China's supporting North Korea, as I mentioned, in really dangerous ways. China is stealing U.S. intellectual property, probably hundreds of billions of dollars a year. If you look at the IP Commission report, perhaps, you know, $225 to $600 billion a year, most of that from China. You know, China is undermining the United States and the global commons, you know, trying to prevent us from being in the international airspace and international waters. You know, the list goes on. And you can't just say, oh, we won't deal with this particular issue now because we've got North Korea or whatever. We got to take care of all of it. And the problem is that China's moving in dangerous directions in so many different phases. And so that's presenting, you know, the central challenge to the United States at this particular time. You know, and with regard to trade, and Clay's question, we need to impose costs on China because we've tried the other way of being generous, trying to integrate China into the international system, hoping that China would reciprocate. For 4 decades, that was a nice theory, but it hasn't worked. So what we need to do now is to impose those costs so that Beijing will then decide perhaps they shouldn't continue to do what they've been doing in the past. I'm not saying it's going to work, but I'm saying everything that we've done up to now for 4 decades hasn't worked. So we got to change.
Do we have the upper hand, though, in the China negotiations in the way that we might with other countries? They hold how much?
The answer is absolutely.
But how much of the U.S. debt do they hold in treasuries? I mean, they got 1.7 trillion. If they cash those out, where would we be? I mean, is that something we need to worry about? Either one can answer.
Sure. I mean,
no, you disagree. Here we go. No, we'll do it. We'll go to both. Let's let Vinay answer first.
Sure. So I would say that the United States obviously has the upper hand. I certainly don't mean to disagree with you in that regard. As you pointed out, China is already in violation of several WTO provisions, and that means that simply actually applying pressure and collecting the international community to actually enforce these standards means that we are able to actually force them to the table to bargain and to step back from some of these destructive business practices like intellectual property theft.
But the amount of debt, U.S. debt that China holds, is that nothing that we need to be concerned about if they decide to cash in?
Yeah, we do not need, there's a lot of things to be concerned about China. That's not one of them. Because think about the way the global markets operate. You know, the Chinese have been talking about what they call the nuclear option since about the summer of 2008. In other words, dumping our debt to hurt us. They don't do it, Clay. The reason they don't do it is because the Chinese know it doesn't work. They sell our debt to hurt us, they get back dollars, because 100% of our obligations are denominated in greenbacks, our own currency. So if they're going to hurt us, they got to take those greenbacks and they've got to then convert them into other currencies, euros, pounds, yen. that means those currencies soar through the ceiling, which means that Brussels, London, and Tokyo got to go out into the global markets to bring their currencies back down to rebalance them, and they've got to buy dollars to do that. So the only people in the world who know that this won't work is Americans. And by the way, the Chinese have been selling American debt since the middle of 2014, and they've been doing that, forget about us, to defend their own currency, because they've got a capital flight of perhaps 2.1 trillion in 2015 and 2016. That's a mortal threat to them. So I don't worry about their holding of debt. We can finance our deficits without China's help. We've been doing it up to now, and we can do it in the future, because our currency is something that people want to hold.
Well, Gordon, it feels confident. That's good. I'm glad. Gordon Chang, Mene Ukwe Barua. Perfect. I'm so sorry. But I did it right. Mene and Gordon, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great to have you.
I feel horrible when I...
No,
Yes,
you did
but
perfect.
I did okay. Well, at least we're not looking at a nuclear threat today
sort
as
of
much
like
as we were a few months
mutually assured
ago.
destruction, but in an economic sense. Versus a
With
nuclear
North
sense.
Korea?
No,
don't think
China.
that-
No,
Oh, no,
about
I'm talking
China.
about we're
yeah,
not
no,
looking
no,
at a-
I'm comparing it to what happened with the Russians, whereas the mutually
I'm just
assured
feeling better about
destructions-
North Korea in
Yes.
this very moment, that we're not staring down the barrel of a nuclear missile
I'm with you
in the
there.
way that we were a few months ago. Let's hope we stay right there. The governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, may be staring down the barrel of something. Cynthia Nixon, Miranda from Sex and the City, she announced her campaign to run for governor of New York, so she's primarying Andrew Cuomo, the current governor. She'd be the first woman and the first openly gay governor of New York. And so we're going to talk about LGBTQ representation in politics and in general with Justine Harmon. She's a senior editor at Glamour. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
There are more women running for offices this year.
Yep.
There are more LGBTQ candidates running for offices around the country this year than there have been in the past. A blue wave, a Democratic blue wave, strong enough to put some of these candidates who might not have been viable in other years in office this year?
I mean, I'm not a political professional in any way, but yeah, I do sense that, the tide is turning. There's an unprecedented amount of black women running for office in Birmingham, Alabama, which is a very red state. Most of them, almost all of them, are Democrats. This is clearly in reaction to Trump, in reaction to special elections like what happened in Pittsburgh and what happened with Doug Jones. People are galvanized, they're excited, and I think culturally, yeah. Again, I can't pretend.
Is that why Cynthia Nixon ran?
I mean, Cynthia Nixon is very compelled to run for a lot of reasons, one of which is that she feels now is the only time that she can't resist running. I mean, she says that for decades people have been like, you should run for governor. And I asked her in our interview, why now? And she was sort of like, I can't hold back any longer. This needs to change. I mean, obviously, Cuomo is a Democrat, but he's a different kind of Democrat than Cynthia Nixon. And she feels that even if she loses in the primary, he'll move left.
And we'll then talk about that because you did interview Cynthia Nixon
Yeah.
about her run. What would she do differently from Cuomo? What's the daylight that she's trying to put?
I mean, I think the big push and the thrust of the campaign she's running on is basically that she is interested in the average person. She's interested in the people who have been underserved by Cuomo. She makes this big talk about her small donations that she's garnered in the first week or so of campaigning. She's very interested in equity and in visibility of marginalized communities in New York. And I do think that dovetails with her position as an LGBT candidate, although I don't necessarily think that it's the top note of her candidacy.
She's run on a belief that politics in New York should be more progressive.
Yes.
That the governor should be more progressive. Does she have any policy points that she's talking about? I mean, I guess these are questions we also should ask her, but
Yes.
you're one of
We'll
the
get
few
her
press
on.
that...
I interviewed her. She played, sidebar, she played Nancy Reagan in a special made for, I think it was the History Channel. And I interviewed her about that. And she was very lovely. And it was actually funny when she was talking about, she had to make out with, Ronald Reagan on screen, even though she's very progressive. I was like, how did you make that work? And she said, well, because it was just about their relationship. It was about love, which transcends all boundaries.
Empathy is definitely the through line of her platform and everything. To talk to her is like to talk to someone you would know. I grew up in a political family. I've been surrounded by politics my whole life. A lot of those people feel performative, present company excluded, of course. But she's a real person. She's passionate about education. She and her wife have both staged a lot of their careers on advocacy for underprivileged families and the education system. I think the policy that concerns her the most is education. And I think that she has 17 years of activism experience and entree into those realms. I do believe that she can affect change.
Do you think she really wants to win, or do you think she wants to?
Yes.
Okay.
I think she wants to win. I don't think that she would embark in such a tenacious campaign if
Bold.
a bold campaign. But look at.
Some would argue that Donald Trump did not run to win.
Oh, we have a comment here, by the way. Cheyenne Reed says, if Schwarzenegger could be a governor, why not Cynthia?
Sure. That's fair. I think there are a lot of differences between those campaigns. But Cynthia, again, you've met her, so I don't see what the plus side is for her if she's just doing it for publicity.
Well, no, I didn't imply she was doing it for publicity, but I think that there are some people, Bernie Sanders included, who they all say they want to win, but when Bernie jumped into the race initially, and I think it kind of snowballed on him, I think he probably went into it with the hope of being able to pull whatever other candidates there were there to the left and get them to talk about issues that were important to them, not necessarily to have as close a primary as he did. So I would certainly not accusing anyone of going in for that reason. But does she have people running her campaign that are traditional politicos, or is she running it? Her first TV interview was with Wendy Williams, which is it's not traditionally the place that you go when you're running for office. Hey, look at
the White House now.
Fair enough. So is she running it in that way?
She has a campaign manager who worked with de Blasio, with whom Nixon is also close. She's very tenacious. She's also very modern, thoroughly modern. You can see the way that she takes barbs and tweets and turns them into a larger part of her platform. But yeah, Wendy Williams was a curious choice. I also think it was considered. She is very interested in appealing to Black voters, and it's part of her constituency. I think it's all very considered, and I think it all feeds back to she wants to win. She's planning to win.
Are we looking down a path in this country where we have a lot more people who are running for office, like Donald Trump, like Cynthia Nixon, like Dwayne Johnson, who hasn't declared or said he's going to run, but who there was speculation about earlier this week? Do you think that's something we should anticipate?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that what a politician isn't necessarily someone who has gone through all of the steps that was once required. It's a more progressive country in terms of how people get where they're going. Here at Glamour, our editor-in-chief is the first editor-in-chief. She's never edited a print magazine before. So she's bringing a different know-how. That doesn't mean she's less competent. It's just a different perspective. And I think that has really infiltrated people who are running for office. And I think a lot of it is emboldened by the internet and the democracy that it provides. And I think we're going to continue to see candidates that at first we say, how dare they? And then the ones who are qualified and are capable, and if they win, might change the world. So I think it's very exciting.
No, I think it's anytime you can talk directly to the people, avoid those old school gatekeepers.
Yeah.
That's direct democracy.
And no one's going to argue that Donald Trump may change the world.
Very true.
Justine Harmon, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it. He's definitely going to change the world.
He is. He's reshaping it in his image.
And it scares the ever-loving out of me.
Let's move on to our next segment, brought to you by one of our Bold partners, Independent Women's Forum. We have friend of the show, Julie Gunlock from the Independent Women's Forum, joining us on Skype. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks for having me.
This is a topic that hits close to home for you. But before it was on the schedule today, I had actually read it and was very intrigued by this law that's been passed in Utah.
It's called the free-range parenting.
Yeah.
And yes, Utah, we are all about freedom and children. This is two things that are great.
So Julie, explain before we get into it what free-range parenting is and what Utah legislators passed as a law to allow Utah parents the right to do.
Sure. I am a free-range parent of 3 little boys, and I'm a big believer in free-range parenting. Basically, in a nutshell, free-range parenting is allowing your child to play, to walk to school, to sort of explore their world without constantly hovering over them. There's this phrase called helicopter parenting, which is the opposite of free-range parenting. And with helicopter parenting, you sort of are constantly overseeing them. Why this law in Utah was passed is because some parents have actually been charged with crimes for allowing their kids to walk to school, for leaving their kids in the car for 5 minutes while they walked into a 7-Eleven to grab a Diet Coke or water. And so this is a bill that intends to protect parents from prosecution for doing, what I think a lot of us, particularly my age, remember as the way our parents raised us. Part of the reason I'm a free-range parent is I wanted to parent my kids the way my parents raised me, and that was they let me have a measure of freedom. They let me explore my world. They let me, work to make my own decisions, to do a little bit of risk analysis and understand the world around me. So that's what free-range parenting is, and that's why this Utah bill is so critical, because, again, parents were really facing harsh criticism, but also prosecution.
So, but there were no laws in place prior to this that specifically said you can't leave your child in the car for 5 minutes to go into the 7-Eleven. Right. It was a judgment call in large part on the arresting officer, the Department of Social Services, the judge involved. It was a judgment call on the part of those folks who arrested and prosecuted them. How does this bill change that? Because it doesn't necessarily specifically allow you now to leave your kid for 5 minutes in the car. It says that parents can use judgment. And does that really do anything? Does that change anything? Are they still not going to be open to the judgment call of a judge who says, no, I don't think your kid was ready for that? How does this really protect people?
Well, look, actually, there are laws in certain cities and states that do prosecute or consider it a crime of negligence to leave your kid in the car for any amount of time. So, those laws do exist, and it's not a federal law; it's state by state. So this law in Utah actually states that parents are allowed to make those decisions based on their own judgment. Now, of course, you're not allowed to leave your car for 10 hours in a hot car with the windows rolled up. This is not intended to protect parents who are abusive or truly negligent. It just protects them from being prosecuted for making common sense decisions. For instance, I left my children in the car for about 15 minutes once. I ran into the store to get a rotisserie chicken, right? Because I hadn't made anything for dinner. And I came out and a police officer was harassing me. And it really scared me. It really frightened me. And this law, if I had been in Utah and this had happened, it would have prevented this to go any further. He might have arrested me. He might have hauled me off to jail. But I wouldn't have been prosecuted because I would have been protected under that law.
So, and we have a commenter here. Kim Studer Massel says, we called that parenting in the 60s and 70s, what you were describing. I want to look at this from the child's perspective because I think the argument for this Utah law is that, in part, it can help children have better decision-making because this whole free-range parenting movement started because one of your colleagues, Lenore Skenazy, let her 9-year-old son ride home by himself on the subway home from school. So. Right. And it's become this movement, free-range parenting. What does this do for the child in terms of allowing them to improve their decision-making abilities? But then also, at what point is the tipping point where you're putting too much on the child in terms of putting too much of a burden on them?
Sure. One clarification. Lenore is not actually a colleague. I am a huge fangirl of Lenore Skenazy. She is actually the founder of the free-range movement and now runs an organization called Let Grow, which tries to get schools to put in place more free-range policies, like letting the kids go out on the playground and play more free play, not all this structured play. But anyway, I think you raise a really good point about what this does for kids. It is very important that children learn skills that will help them as adults, like making good decisions, being independent, not being afraid of everything. And when you allow kids a little bit more freedom to explore their world, to make these decisions, decisions, if you're hovering over your child and they come to an intersection and you say, look both ways, look both ways, look both ways, and you're never away from your child, they may not learn that skill on their own because they always expect their parent standing behind them to tell them what to do. So this is really critical for children to develop coping skills, decision-making skills, and again, understand what they are capable of. The key about free ranging is understanding who your child is. I have 3 little boys. I let some do some things that I don't allow others to do. I make a judgment based on the child. So, my one little boy, I might not let him walk all the way to the pizza shop by himself because I don't feel he's responsible enough for it, but I let the other 2 do it.
Do you anticipate these laws in other states?
I do. I think this is really I think it's on fire now. I think this is a movement. The other reason is I think with parenting, I think as a parent, there's safety in numbers. If you're the only free ranger in your neighborhood, you sort of feel like a weirdo. But then if you have other people doing it and there's more kids roaming the neighborhood and there's more freedom and more of these parents want to do it, there's safety in numbers. So I think that more parents are doing this. It's becoming more normalized. And so I do think that this will catch on. I think other legislatures are aware of this. And again, Lenore Skenazy is doing a lot of work to promote this to other states.
Well, we'll have something to watch out for. I found it a fascinating article when I read about it, and I don't think I'm.
Are you a free range parent?
I think I'm closer. I think I'm closer to it than not. But I will say that the comment that we had that's now disappeared from the screen that said this was parenting in the 60s and 70s. I think about that all the time. I'd love to let mine just go run in the woods, but I also think that 2018, I thought it was still 19 something, if only. 2018 is a lot different than the 1960s and 70s, and so I think that there's an argument for adapting with the times a little bit too. So it'll be interesting to see what folks do in other states and how successful it is in Utah. I'm certainly not in opposition to it. Julie Gunlock, thanks so much from the Independent Women's Forum for joining us. Come back again.
Thanks. I will just close on saying today is a lot safer than it was 20 years ago. So your kids are growing up in a lot safer environment.
Depends on where you live, Julie.
But overall, the national crime rate has gone down.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
It's true.
Okay. More numbers. Thank you very much,
We
Julie.
love numbers. Bye, Julie.
Common sense. Common sense is what I'm talking
Common
about.
sense. There we go.
Goodness. You want to introduce, this is a good friend of yours in the next segment.
It is. I'm so excited that he's here. And this is for our Bookster segment. So folks who follow BoldTV know that Bookster is a website for book lovers and so much more. And so for our Bookster segment, we have my friend Chakar Ghazal here. And he's here to talk about his book called The Tale of Tala. And it was inspired by his travels throughout Europe and the Middle East, talking to refugees about their experiences. Welcome, Chakar.
Hi.
So good to have
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us
Super
about
jet
Tala.
lagged.
Are you?
Yeah.
Where'd you come in from?
Dubai.
Oh, that's quite the flight. Tell us about Tala.
Tala is a refugee. She's a girl who travels from Lebanon going to Germany. And in Slovenia, she gets recruited by a human trafficking group where she becomes a prostitute. And she meets with an American writer who decides to help her find her missing husband and tell her story to the world, especially about human trafficking today in Europe.
Now, you're a refugee yourself.
Yep.
Any of your own experience? How much of your own experience did Tala experience too?
A lot, because Tala in the book, in Tale of Tala, Tala is a Palestinian refugee. So there's a lot from my childhood that I...
Yes, so you're a Palestinian refugee. You grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon.
Yeah, so there's a lot in Tala's story that it's things that I've seen as a child. So it makes it even more real. It makes the story more real. And then as later on, as a reporter, when I was working in Europe and interviewing refugees, I think I understood what they were telling me more than just a news piece. Like, it was a human story that my grandparents lived, my parents lived, I lived, so it becomes more personal.
Do you think that people have difficulty understanding the human part of refugees, of the refugee crisis, especially from the Middle East? I mean, we see it in the news a lot. We won't get into the politics of refugees in the United States, but I think that a lot of people would argue that people don't see the humanity behind refugees and therefore want to keep them out, want to restrict them from this country. Do you agree that that's an issue? Is that something you're hoping that someone's going to pick up this book and feel differently about?
Well, yeah, I don't think like people are not relating to or do not understand it. I think it's just this concept where the news and the media has given us a certain narrative, so it's always like black or white. And behind that, there are human beings living these stories. So with Tale of Tala, like I wanted to humanize the refugee crisis, because today we're slammed with numbers, we're slammed with figures about 50+ million people have been displaced, but we don't know that among these 50 million there's a lover, there's a nurse, there's someone who lost their child, or there's someone getting married at the border, or falling in love for the first time meeting an immigration officer, or all these stories are stories that are happening. So
that would be a bold partnership right there. We'll have them get married on the show. It's bold. But so yeah, that's what was going to be my question about why you made this as fiction, because you have been a journalist and a nonfiction writer and a reporter. What was different for you about the process of writing fiction versus nonfiction? And was it just easier for you to humanize because it was fiction?
Yeah, I wanted that. I like writing about love and the romance side, and I wanted to introduce a refugee character in a new way, in a way where it's not what we're like today. When I go online and I read the news or pick up a paper, I see all these tragic stories when it comes to refugees, but there are dreamers among refugees, there are lovers, as I said. So this is where the whole idea of fictionalizing Tala came from.
Art tends to mirror what's going on in real life. What do you hope people take away from this, and do you hope that it accomplishes? Listen, Esquire's Man of the Year for the Middle East, Esquire, Man of the Year.
That's right.
That's
Man of the Year. I think we got that article up,
look at that. Look at that.
Let's put it up.
For Esquire Middle East for 2015.
Middle East?
You certainly have an impact with your work thus far. What do you hope people take away from this?
From Tale of Tala to know that the refugees are not aliens or not weird creatures. They're human beings who have happened to go through hard circumstances. And also Tale of Tala has a message for human traffickers, because I really, around human trafficking, because it really touched me when I was in Europe to see how women and men, children are going missing, or they're going down really a dark road. When we can avoid that, we can better document refugees, we can better track refugees where they're going from one border to another. And the book now is touring. I was in the UK Parliament, presented the book, and that was a really, good message today to remind governments that there are some actions that need to be taken in coordination with UNHCR.
Yeah, I don't think, I've just recently met a few people who have worked to fight human trafficking here in America. It is an enormous problem in Florida, Virginia, in North Carolina. I think a lot of people might not be aware of how common it is, even in a country as developed as the U.S.
Yeah, and today, with when there's mess and chaos, human trafficking becomes a bit easier, and sadly. So we need to up our game in terms of when refugees are arriving at European borders today. We need to document. I call it right now an emotional diarrhea state, and we can't be in that state. We have to be proactive, because the figures are scary, and there are so many Talas today, and we want to avoid more Talas from happening.
Tale of Tala, Shakir Kazal, thank you so much for joining us. Come back and see us with the next one. Look forward to it.
Yeah, no, that's emotional diarrhea. That's that describes
the name
a lot
of my
what
memoir.
I've gone through.
And thank you guys for joining us too. Hopefully you will remember, as I'm sure you already told them, to like us on Facebook and follow the page on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, all of that social media stuff.
Yes, and make sure
we won't take your data.
Yes, we won't. And if you liked the episode, make sure to share it with your friends. Keep the conversation going, because when you share it with your friends, that means more friends will see it, and we keep growing. And that means more of this guy.
Okay, sorry.
Are you feeling better at the end of the show?
I was trying to. You wanted them to share it.
Yes.
Don't tease them with something they don't want. Make sure you join us next Tuesday at 9 a.m. for the weekly episode of Bold Business, and again next Friday at 10 a.m. for BoldTV, Bold Life, which is normally on at noon. Right after us is taking a break this week, but they'll be back at noon next week too. So you got all 3 Bolds next week,
That's right.
Tuesday and 2 on Friday. We'll see you then.
Have a great weekend.